Somewhere in Texas, a weapon just came off the production line years faster than anyone expected. And the reason that matters has almost nothing to do with the war currently making headlines. Before we go further, here's my ask. If stories hiding underneath the daily news cycle are exactly what you come here for, hit that like button right now. It costs nothing, and it tells this channel to keep digging where other coverage stops. Subscribe if you want the full picture instead of the surface version. And if you know someone who only follows the missile footage from the Middle East, send them this video because they are missing a much bigger story happening quietly in the background. While American strikes keep grinding through targets across Iran night after night, a much quieter announcement came out of Washington that barely registered in the daily news cycle. It deserves far more attention than it got. The National Nuclear Security Administration confirmed that every critical internal component scheduled for completion this fiscal year on a new nuclear weapon called the B-6113 had been finished 3 months ahead of schedule. Combine that with an earlier milestone, the very first complete B-6113 unit rolling off the line at the Pantex plant in Texas nearly a full year sooner than planners had projected. And you get a program that has quietly become one of the fastest nuclear weapons developments the United States has fielded since the Cold War itself. The timing of that announcement, landing in the middle of an active air campaign against Iran, is not something serious defense analysts are treating as pure coincidence. That said, coincidence and timing is not the same thing as causation, and the difference between those two ideas is exactly where this story either gets reported honestly or gets flattened into clickbait. A nuclear weapons program does not spin up in a matter of weeks. Everything involved, the materials, the facilities, the specialized workforce, the layers of certification, moves on a timeline measured in years, sometimes decades. So before we go any further, it helps to hold two separate facts in your head at the same time. This specific announcement landed during an active war, and this specific program began long before the war existed. Both of those things are true, and understanding this story means resisting the urge to collapse them into a single, simple explanation. Let's be precise about what this actually is, because the terminology gets misused constantly, and getting it wrong changes the entire meaning of the story. This is not evidence that the United States is preparing to drop a nuclear weapon on Iran. There is no public indication that the B-6113 has been assigned to any target connected to the current campaign. No indication it has been earmarked for the Strait of Hormuz, and no indication it has been paired with any specific underground facility inside Iranian territory. What this actually is a signal about how the Pentagon is thinking many years into the future about adversaries who bury their most important military assets deep underground, surround them with layered air defenses, and gamble that sheer depth alone will keep them safe from anything short of a nuclear weapon. The B-6113 exists to make that gamble considerably less certain. The program's origin actually predates the current conflict by several years, which is worth remembering before drawing too straight a line between this week's headlines and a weapon system that has been in motion since long before Iran became the immediate story. The Pentagon first announced the concept publicly back in late 2023, describing it at the time as a reasonable response to a rapidly shifting global security environment rather than a reaction to any single event. Defense officials have stayed fairly consistent in stressing that the decision to build this weapon was not triggered by one specific crisis, but reflected an ongoing years-long assessment of where potential adversaries were investing their own military infrastructure, specifically how much effort rival nations were putting into digging valuable assets deeper underground and hardening them against exactly the kind of conventional weapons the United States already possesses in abundance. Here is a correction that matters more than it might sound like it should. This weapon gets casually described online as a tactical nuclear bomb. That label is misleading. The broader B-61 family has included both tactical battlefield-oriented versions and larger strategic versions across its decades in service, but the B-6113 specifically is being certified for delivery exclusively by strategic bomber aircraft, and it will be stored on domestic soil rather than forward deployed with tactical fighter squadrons the way some earlier variants were. Under American nuclear doctrine, that placement alone puts it in the strategic category. This is not a weapon designed to be slung under a frontline fighter jet and dropped on a battlefield target the way a conventional bomb would be. It belongs to the tier of the arsenal built to influence entire wars, entire governments, entire questions of national survival, the deterrent layer, not the tactical layer. This distinction is not just bureaucratic nitpicking. It shapes how allies interpret the weapon, how adversaries calculate risk around it, and how arms control agreements categorize it going forward. Calling a strategic deterrent weapon tactical and casual conversation makes it sound smaller, more usable, more likely to appear in an actual battlefield scenario than it realistically is. Getting that distinction right is not about softening the story. It is about describing the weapon as what it actually is, rather than what a more dramatic sounding label might imply. The word gravity trips people up too, and it is worth clearing up quickly. A gravity bomb is not a primitive weapon just because the name sounds old-fashioned. It simply means the weapon releases from an aircraft and falls toward its target under gravity, rather than flying under its own propulsion the way a cruise missile or ballistic missile does. Modern gravity bombs, including this one, still carry sophisticated guidance packages. The B-61 Tongan 13 inherits many of the same safety, security, and precision features developed for its immediate predecessor, the B-61 12, including a modern tail kit that steers the weapon after release and dramatically tightens its accuracy compared to older, unguided gravity bombs from decades past. And accuracy genuinely matters here, maybe more than in any other category of weapon in the entire arsenal. A bomb that lands closer to its intended aim point does not need to compensate with sheer explosive size for a large margin of error the way older, less precise weapons did. It can concentrate its destructive force closer to the exact point planners actually want to hit, and that precision meaningfully increases effectiveness against a hardened, well-defended target. But precision does not make the weapon small, clean, or safe in any absolute sense. It is still a nuclear detonation. Extreme heat, overpressure, ionizing radiation, and the possibility of radioactive fallout depending on the detonation's height and conditions. None of that changes because the guidance system got better. Precision changes where the weapon lands. It does not change where the weapon fundamentally is. Publicly available reporting places the B-61-13's warhead lineage close to an older, higher-yield member of the B-61 family. Outside nuclear policy analysts who track this program closely have put the upper end of its likely yield somewhere in the range of a few hundred kilotons, broadly comparable to, and in some estimates, roughly 24 times more powerful than, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. The government has not officially published a precise maximum yield figure, which is fairly standard practice for this category of weapon, so any specific number circulating publicly should be treated as an informed estimate rather than an official disclosure. That comparison to Hiroshima needs real context before anyone draws the obvious-sounding conclusion from it. Multiplying explosive energy by 20 sometimes does not mean multiplying the destruction radius by that same factor. Terrain, altitude at detonation, weather conditions, height of burst, and the strength of surrounding structures all shape the actual outcome in ways that do not scale in a simple straight line. Even accounting for all of that, a weapon in this yield class could still devastate a large military complex and cause catastrophic damage well beyond the immediate target area. The scale here is not something to minimize. At the same time, comparisons like this one deserve careful handling because they can just as easily mislead through exaggeration as through understatement. Headlines built entirely around a Hiroshima comparison tend to imply a kind of simple multiplication. 20 times the yield equals 20 times the devastation, when the actual physics involved is far more complicated than that. A weapon's real-world effect depends heavily on where and how it detonates, not simply on the raw energy figure attached to it in a headline. Responsible reporting on a weapon like this treats the yield figure as one input among several, not as the entire story by itself. Before we go further into how this weapon actually works, and what it could realistically do against a hardened target, one quick favor. If breakdowns like this, the ones that slow down and actually explain the physics and the policy, instead of just the scary headline, are what you come here for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this kind of story deserves more attention than it usually gets. It is also worth being precise about the underlying physics, because this is not simply a scaled-up version of the weapon that leveled Hiroshima in 1945. That earlier bomb worked through nuclear fission, splitting heavy atoms like uranium or plutonium apart and releasing the energy locked inside those bonds. Modern high-yield weapons like this one are generally thermonuclear, meaning they use a fission explosion as a first stage, specifically to create the extreme pressure and temperature conditions needed to trigger a second stage involving nuclear fusion, the same basic physical process that powers the sun, except released here in an uncontrolled fraction of a second, rather than sustained over billions of years. That two-stage design is what allows a modern weapon this size to produce vastly more explosive power than the comparatively simple first-generation atomic weapons ever could. The B-61-13 belongs to that later hydrogen bomb era of weapons design, not the earlier and comparatively primitive atomic bomb era, and that particular combination of compact size, precision guidance, and yield is exactly what makes military planners consider it strategically significant. So can something like this actually destroy a deeply buried nuclear or military facility? The honest answer is complicated, and it resists the simple headline version of the question. The B-6113 is not publicly described as a dedicated Earth-penetrating weapon the way a purpose-built bunker buster is. The United States separately fields the B-6112 with an Earth-penetrating capability, and even that weapon cannot simply drill hundreds of feet through solid mountain rock the way people sometimes imagine. Earth penetration runs into hard physical limits fast. A weapon striking the ground at very high velocity experiences enormous structural stress, and pushing that speed too far risks the weapon destroying itself on impact before it can function as intended. Fail to penetrate deep enough in the other direction, and a large share of the detonation's energy simply escapes upward and outward instead of concentrating where it is needed underground. That does not mean a nuclear weapon is powerless against a deep underground complex, even without directly reaching the main chamber. The shockwave from a detonation can still travel through surrounding rock and soil, collapsing tunnel entrances, severing ventilation and power systems, cracking support structures, and burying equipment under tons of rubble, functionally disabling a facility even if its innermost chamber technically survives intact. But the deeper and better engineered the target, the less certain any single strike becomes at actually destroying what matters most inside it. That is exactly why military planners spend so much effort studying geology, construction methods, burial depths, access tunnels, and hidden secondary exits before ever concluding that a nuclear option is even relevant to a given target. A nuclear weapon is not automatically the perfect bunker buster just because it is the largest tool in the shed. Repeated conventional strikes can often collapse entrances and support systems without ever crossing the nuclear threshold at all, and cyber operations, intelligence penetration, or special operations forces frequently offer alternative paths to disabling a hardened site. Nuclear options only become genuinely relevant in the planning process when leaders conclude a target is important enough and hardened enough that no other tool in the arsenal can reliably reach it. That is precisely where the B-6113 seems to fit into the broader picture. The Pentagon has described the weapon publicly as providing additional options against certain harder large area military targets, and that specific phrase, large area, is doing real work in that sentence. This is not framed as a weapon built around a single isolated underground chamber. It is aimed more broadly at sprawling military installations, hardened command complexes, dispersed missile sites, or strategic facilities, where a single high-yield detonation could functionally affect several connected elements across a wide footprint at once, rather than requiring separate strikes against each individual piece. Delivery matters just as much as the warhead itself here. The B-6113 is expected to be carried by the B-2 Spirit and eventually by the B-21 Raider currently entering service, both purpose-built for penetrating heavily defended contested airspace without being detected. That stealth and range combination gives a bomber-delivered weapon like this a capability no ballistic missile can offer, no matter how sophisticated the missile's guidance. A bomber can be launched as a deliberate signal, held on station, and turned back before any weapon is ever released, all without irreversibly committing an attack. That flexibility makes a nuclear-capable bomber simultaneously a physical weapon and a political message, two different tools folded into a single airframe, and that dual nature is central to how this entire category of weapon actually functions in practice. We are now well past the halfway point of this breakdown. If you have made it this far, you clearly want the complete picture instead of the alarming headline version most coverage settles for. So do me one favor, share this with somebody who saw the words nuclear bomb in a headline this week and assumed the worst without any of the actual context. It is worth pausing on the pace of this specific program because it genuinely stands out even against the backdrop of a defense industry not exactly known for moving quickly. The first fully completed production unit came off the assembly line in May of 2025, nearly a full year ahead of the original internal target date. Then, in the summer of 2026, the National Nuclear Security Administration announced that every canned subassembly scheduled for the current fiscal year had been finished 3 months early. A canned subassembly is one of the most sensitive and tightly controlled components in a modern two-stage thermonuclear weapon, tied directly to the weapon's secondary stage. When a unit like that receives its official certification, formally referred to inside the program as diamond stamping, it means the component has cleared every quality and reliability requirement necessary for actual inclusion in the nuclear stockpile, not simply a testing environment. It would be easy and inaccurate to read that early completion announcement as evidence the United States suddenly rushed an entire nuclear weapons program into existence purely as a reaction to the war with Iran. That is not really what happened. The first production unit had already been completed more than a year before the current campaign against Iran ever began, so the foundation for this program was well underway long before this particular conflict started. What the more recent announcement actually reflects is a scheduled internal production milestone for the current fiscal year, landing ahead of its own already accelerated timeline, which still matters enormously, just not as a panic response to current headlines. Nuclear weapons production depends on specialized materials, extraordinarily secure facilities, uncompromising quality control, and a narrow pool of people with the specific technical expertise required. Finishing meaningfully ahead of schedule under those constraints is a genuine institutional achievement, when it signals that the United States is successfully rebuilding a nuclear production base that had slowed considerably in the decades following the Cold War, while simultaneously sending a fairly unambiguous deterrent message to every government paying attention to American military capability right now. It is also important to understand what this program is not doing to the overall size of the American nuclear arsenal. The B-6113 does not increase the total planned stockpile. The United States intends to produce it within the number of B-61 bombs already planned, meaning some previously scheduled production of an earlier variant is simply being replaced by B-6113 production instead. The goal here is not accumulating more bombs. It is changing the mix of capabilities available to the president at any given moment, trading some planned lower yield precision weapons for a comparable number of higher yield precision weapons instead. This connects directly to the eventual retirement of the B-83, currently the most powerful gravity bomb still active in the American arsenal, with a maximum yield reported in the range of roughly 1 megaton, several times larger than even the higher publicly estimated yield of the B-6113. The B-83 is an older design, and the United States has been steadily moving it toward retirement for years now. The B-6113 does not fully replace that enormous raw explosive power. What it does instead is offer a newer, more accurate, and more operationally flexible option for at least some of the missions planners worry could otherwise be left uncovered once the B-83 eventually leaves service entirely. So under what circumstances would the United States actually use a weapon like this? American nuclear policy does not publish a simple checklist, and there is a reason for that ambiguity that is actually intentional rather than an oversight. The stated position has long been that nuclear weapons would only be considered under extreme circumstances, specifically to defend the vital interests of the United States, its allies, or its partners. Authority to order that use rests with the President alone. Congress does not need to vote before a nuclear use order can be issued, although the military chain of command is required to verify that any such order is both authentic and lawful before it can be carried out. In practical terms, actually using a weapon like the B-6113 would rank among the most consequential decisions in modern history, weighing military necessity against civilian casualties, radioactive fallout, the reactions of allied nations, and the very real danger of a far wider regional or even global escalation. Against Iran specifically, that threshold would sit especially high for a very specific reason worth stating plainly. Iran does not currently possess a declared operational nuclear arsenal of its own. Using an American nuclear weapon against a state that is not itself nuclear armed would break a taboo held without exception since 1945. It carries the potential to isolate the United States, diplomatically trigger a wave of retaliation across the wider region, put American forces stationed throughout the Middle East in far greater danger, and quite possibly push additional countries watching closely toward pursuing nuclear weapons of their own as a hedge against exactly this kind of precedent being set. That is precisely why the far more likely function of a weapon like the B-6113 is not battlefield use at all. It is deterrence, plain and simple. The entire purpose of a deterrent weapon is to manufacture uncertainty in an adversary's mind, and that uncertainty does most of its real work long before any weapon is ever employed. A government pouring resources into a deep underground bunker has to seriously ask itself whether that bunker is actually deep enough anymore. A commander moving critical military assets underground has to ask whether those assets can genuinely survive an American strike under worst-case conditions. A nuclear-armed rival watching all of this unfold has to ask whether even its most hardened, most carefully protected facilities remain meaningfully out of reach. Deterrence works partly through outright fear, but just as much through sustained doubt. An adversary does not need to know precisely how or when such a weapon might be used. It only needs to genuinely believe that the capability is real, that a credible delivery platform exists to carry it, and that a president could plausibly authorize its use under sufficiently extreme conditions. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why a program like this generates headlines, even when nothing about current battlefield operations actually changes. A deterrent weapon succeeds precisely when it never gets used. When the mere existence of the capability quietly shapes decisions being made in bunkers and command centers thousands of miles away, decisions the public will likely never see or hear about directly. Measuring the success of a program like the B-6113 by counting how many times it gets deployed misunderstands its entire purpose. Its real measure of success is how many decisions it silently discourages before they ever happen. The ongoing war with Iran gives all of this immediate real-world relevance, but that relevance should not be allowed to distort the actual facts of the situation. The B-6113 is not a normal tool being reached for in the current campaign along the Strait of Hormuz. It is not a substitute for cruise missiles, conventional bunker-busting bombs, naval blockades, or the ongoing suppression of enemy air defenses. It functions as a strategic reserve held back specifically for a crisis scenario in which a future president concludes the ordinary conventional toolkit is genuinely no longer sufficient. For right now, the United States still has an extensive menu of conventional options available and actively in use, continuing to strike missile forces, command centers, naval assets, logistics routes, air defenses, and underground entrances, tightening a maritime blockade, layering in cyber and intelligence operations, reinforcing regional allies, and repositioning forces, all without ever approaching the nuclear threshold. But every one of those conventional strikes still carries an implicit message about where the ceiling actually sits. Iran is being shown, strike by strike, that its military infrastructure can be mapped, isolated, and systematically dismantled using entirely conventional means. The B-6113 program adds a quieter, considerably darker undertone running beneath that entire campaign. It tells Tehran, and it tells every other government watching this play out from a safe distance, that the United States is simultaneously modernizing the specific category of weapons it deliberately holds in reserve for the most extreme wars imaginable. The existence of the B-6113 is not evidence that Washington is preparing to actually use a nuclear weapon against Iran. It is evidence that Washington wants every current and future adversary to understand one thing clearly. Even the deepest, most heavily fortified target in the world may no longer sit as far beyond reach as its builders once assumed. There is a broader pattern sitting behind the single weapons program that is easy to miss if you only look at the B-6113 in isolation. It is one of 7 separate warhead modernization efforts currently running in parallel across the National Nuclear Security Administration, according to the agency's own public accounting. Multiple of those programs are currently tracking ahead of their projected schedules. That is not a small operational detail. For decades following the end of the Cold War, America's nuclear production infrastructure was widely described, including by government auditors themselves, as aging, understaffed, and in some cases barely capable of maintaining the existing stockpile, let alone developing new capabilities on any kind of accelerated timeline. A production enterprise finishing major modernization milestones consistently ahead of schedule is a very different signal than a single weapon quietly entering service. It points toward a broader institutional recovery, one that foreign intelligence services and defense ministries around the world are almost certainly tracking just as closely as the individual weapon itself. That institutional story is arguably the more consequential thread running through all of this, even though it rarely gets the same attention as a single weapon with a dramatic yield figure attached to it. Rebuilding a specialized industrial workforce, one capable of handling extraordinarily sensitive materials under strict safety and security requirements, is not something that happens through a single funding announcement. It requires years of training, facility investment, and institutional knowledge transfer from an older generation of technicians to a newer one. A production enterprise capable of hitting multiple accelerated deadlines across several programs simultaneously suggests that kind of foundational rebuilding has been underway for years, largely outside public view, long before any of these individual milestones ever became a headline. Think about what that means for how other nations are reading this moment right now, well beyond Iran specifically. Every country that has invested heavily in deep underground facilities over the past few decades built those facilities based on assumptions about what the existing American arsenal could realistically reach. A faster, more precise, more reliably produced weapon changes that underlying math, even without a single new capability being pointed at any specific country by name. That is exactly how deterrence is designed to function. It does not need to announce a target to reshape decisions being made in capitals that were never mentioned in a single official statement. It is also worth sitting honestly with the tension embedded in a story like this one. On one hand, a nuclear weapons program advancing ahead of schedule during an active war naturally raises real anxiety, and that anxiety deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. On the other hand, the specific facts here point toward a program with origins predating this conflict, a doctrine built around deterrence rather than battlefield use, and a stated threshold for actual use that remains extraordinarily high, particularly against a state that does not itself possess nuclear weapons. Holding both of those realities, at once genuine anxiety and genuine context, is more honest than collapsing the story into either pure alarm or pure reassurance. Here are a few things worth watching closely in the months ahead, because each one will tell you more about where this specific story is actually heading than any single headline ever could. Watch whether officials continue describing the B-6113 primarily in terms of deterrence and modernization, or whether that language shifts toward anything resembling operational planning tied to a specific ongoing conflict. That shift, if it ever happens, would represent a genuinely significant change from everything publicly stated so far. Watch how other nuclear-armed states respond diplomatically and militarily to this pattern of accelerated American production, because deterrence is a two-way conversation, and reactions from other capitals often reveal more about how seriously this capability is being taken than anything said in Washington itself. Watch the pace of the other modernization programs running alongside the B-6113, because the single program finishing early could be an isolated success story, while an entire enterprise finishing consistently ahead of schedule points towards something much larger about America's long-term nuclear posture. And watch how the conventional campaign against Iran continues to unfold, because the conventional toolkit remaining sufficient, or clearly proving insufficient, is precisely the variable that would determine whether a weapon like this one ever moves from quiet background context into something resembling an active consideration. Whatever happens next in the war with Iran, the underlying industrial story behind the B-6113 is not going away. It reflects a much longer-term shift in how the United States is rebuilding its capacity to design, certify, and produce nuclear weapons after decades of comparative decline, and it is likely to keep shaping how officials talk about deterrence long after this particular conflict has run its course. If this breakdown gave you the full context instead of just another alarming headline, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment telling me whether stories like this one, the quiet, easily missed announcements sitting underneath the loud headlines, are what you want more of from this channel. And share this with somebody who needs the complete picture instead of a single frightening phrase pulled out of context. A bomb finished years ahead of schedule in a vault in Texas. A weapon built not for the battlefield in front of us, but for the decision no president ever wants to actually face. And a quiet signal sent to every government on Earth still betting that depth alone can keep their most important secrets safe. That is the real story sitting underneath this week's headlines. Not a war weapon, but a message, built with extraordinary precision and delivered without ever needing to be used at all. Stories like this one rarely trend the way a dramatic battlefield headline does. And that is exactly the problem worth naming directly. A single missile strike generates immediate visceral footage, a quiet production milestone. At a facility in Texas generates a press release most people will never read. But the quieter story is very often the one that shapes the next several decades of how powerful nations calculate risk against each other, long after the specific war has become a chapter in a history book rather than a headline on a screen. Paying attention to that kind of story now, before it becomes obvious in hindsight, is exactly the habit worth building as a viewer, regardless of which conflict happens to be dominating the news cycle on any given week.